More importantly, our speaker today is Yunus Bakhsh, who's also formerly a health worker and unison activist, now a barrister and also a member of Newcastle Socialist Workers Party.
I'll just a quick straw poll, really. How many people here have seen the Ken Burn documentary on Vietnam? Right, I might as well not do the meeting then. Because if you've seen it, it is the most phenomenal documentary. Now, if you haven't seen it, watch it, because I'm not going to really go through, and I can't do that justice, because it's the most fantastic depiction of the defeat of America that you can ever imagine. But I'll try to really look at some of the issues that arise from the Vietnam War. And the first thing you have to say is this. If there is a single word that scares the American ruling class more than any other, it's not Trump, it's Vietnam. The Vietnam syndrome has been something which has inhibited the most powerful imperial and military regime in history from being really able to exert its real power and strength. The Vietnam syndrome ran through, and the fear of defeat, the defeat that they suffered in Vietnam, ran through and runs through every single adventure, military adventure that the American ruling class get involved in or contemplate getting involved in. And that is still the case absolutely today. And on the face of it, you'd have to say the US shouldn't have lost. How could they lose? Here is, on the one hand, this fantastically advanced, the most powerful military, political, economic machine in human history, pitted against an underdeveloped country which had, the GDP of Vietnam was a fraction of the American military budget. And yet still they managed to lose it. And the significance of having the meeting now 50 years on, is because 50 years ago, the war in Vietnam took a decisive turning point. But as anybody watches the documentary will know, because, and again, one of the things about the documentary is it's based on the release of confidential papers, the Pentagon Papers. They knew they couldn't win the war as early as 1965. But in 1968, the war took an absolutely fundamental shift away from America. But first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about the history of Vietnam. It was called Indochina. It was a French colony, a colony that they run in their typical, and the French ruling class's typical brutal manner, treating the Vietnamese people as not even second or third class citizens, but simply as coolies, people who would do the bidding of their French masters. Now, during the Second World War, France was the French were kicked out of Vietnam by the Japanese, who initially were greeted by the Vietnamese people as sort of liberators, certainly to be preferred to the French. That didn't work out for them. At the end of the Second World War, after Japan had been defeated, the French were attempted to re-establish their control over Vietnam, and came an enormous cropper. They were met with mass resistance throughout the whole of Vietnam, and a famous battle in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. The French army were routed. And just by the way, what's great about the documentary is it shows the French troops coming back to Marseille after the defeat, disembarking, and the French dockers throwing bricks at them and denouncing them. Absolutely brilliant. That's exactly how our class should respond to imperial adventures. But what came out of that defeat was negotiations at Geneva, which led to the division of Vietnam. A division, incidentally, which was based on the division of Korea, which had just taken place the year before the end of the Korean War, and a division which had been imposed not simply by the Western imperialist powers, but also by the Stalinist regimes, Russia and China in particular. So you had a situation in Vietnam where in the north there was a communist or state capitalist regime, and in the South it was effectively a client puppet regime of the West. Now, gradually, the US was drawn into propping up the regime in the South, and they did so for ideological reasons, because there isn't really, and there isn't a huge amount of economic resources in Vietnam, but the American ruling class at that time, heavily embroiled in the Cold War, saw as a necessary step for them to prevent what they called the Domino Theory. That is, that if Vietnam went communist, then it would lead to a whole series of other states going in the same direction. And of course, their big fear was that with China being now under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, this would be a catastrophe. And they looked at what their aims were in Vietnam, and they employed a man called Robert McNamara. And Robert McNamara used to work for the Ford Motor Company. You know, the interaction between sections of the ruling class, the military-industrial complex, couldn't be reflected better in anybody other than Robert McNamara, who's a systems analyst. And this is what he wrote. He said, what were the US aims? He said, 70% to avoid a humiliating US defeat. And if I can get this, 70% to avoid a humiliating US defeat, 20% to keep South Vietnam territory from Chinese hands, 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better life. That's really good, isn't it? 10%. And also to emerge from the crisis with unacceptable taint from methods used, not, he says, to help a friend, although it would be hard to stay if asked out. In other words, the aims of the American ruling class were nothing to do with helping the Vietnamese people, or maybe 10% of it, but it was actually to uphold and ensure American military and political dominance in the region insofar as that was possible. Now, what that meant was that the regime in the South, so corrupt and rotten, had to be propped up increasingly by what the Americans called military advisors. I mean, they used the same term, by the way, in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But very quickly it became apparent that the only way they could maintain any degree of support for that regime was by the use of large numbers of ground troops. And by 1965, there were 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And they effectively were there to keep a absolutely rotten dictatorship in power. Now, as I said, it's already the case by that time that the key sections of the American ruling class amongst themselves are saying, we can't win this war. This war cannot be won. But that's not what they told the American public. I mean, that wouldn't be a very good message, would it? We're sending your sons to die in a war that they can't win. So they told the American public, we're winning, look at the body count, and body count was everything. And they said, we're winning this war. The Viet Cong, who were the guerrilla fighters in the South, cannot defeat us. We're on our way to victory. In January 1968, that was completely shattered and destroyed by what became known as the Tet Offensive, Tet being the name of the Vietnamese New Year. And the North Koreans launched a massive offensive throughout the entire the South, attacking towns and cities everywhere. They took, for example, the central capital of Hue, and they held it for a relatively short period of time. They got guerrillas into the US Embassy compound in Saigon. Everywhere the Vietnamese attacked. Now, in one sense, the Tet Offensive was a military disaster. They lost tens of thousands of their fighters. And they didn't succeed. They had hoped that it would trigger an uprising amongst the South Vietnamese people who actually detested the South Vietnamese dictatorship. That didn't happen, and maybe we can discuss why that didn't happen in the later on. But militarily, the Tet Offensive did not defeat the American army. But what it did do is it shattered completely the notion being put forward by the American ruling class that the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese, were defeated and couldn't resist. Because after all, if you can get your fighters into the American compound in Saigon, not one or two of them, but hundreds of them, then the only way they could do that would be to have the support, the tacit support, at the very least, of the Vietnamese people in the south. In other words, what it proved is they weren't just fighting a guerrilla army based in the north, they were fighting the entire Vietnamese people. And that completely, as I say, shattered them. And of course, we had the quite famous quote from a US general that in response to Tet, in order to save a town, they had to destroy it. I mean, this is what he said. It's a very famous quote. And it really just showed the depths to which the American ruling class were being forced to respond to this situation. And it, as I say, it completely shattered the political argument about why America was in Vietnam. Now, to answer the question, because that's really the point of these meetings, why did they lose? How did they lose? I think we have to say, first and foremost, without a shadow of a doubt, they lost because of the resistance, the heroism, and the tenacity of the Vietnamese people. That's why they lost, because without that, without those Vietnamese people, and when you see the way in which they fought back, the tunnels that they did, living underground, the way in which they moved heavy artillery down the Ho Chi Minh Trail on their backs, the sacrifice that they gave to fight for liberation, without that, America wouldn't have lost. First and foremost. So we have to say that without question. However, it wasn't just that, because it was the impact of the resistance on the American army and consequently on American society, which also meant that the American ruling class, as I say, and I'll go on to explain, suffered the most significant defeat that they have ever had in their history. You see, the US Army that was sent to Vietnam was effectively a conscript army. It had to be an army that was drawn from the mass of the population of America. And the mass of the population of America were workers, working class people. It came, of course, at a time of economic boom, when in America there was full employment. So therefore, in a sense, we have economic conscription in Britain, where if you had a map of Britain and you put where people come from, where the army recruits from, every single one of those areas where they recruit most people from will be deprived, working class areas, northeast, Liverpool, etc. In America, where you had a job, suddenly you were told, hey, you're no longer in that job, you're going to fight in a war in Vietnam 10,000 miles away. And like any army, the US Army reflected the society it came from and also the tensions that existed inside that society. First of all, the army was divided on the basis of class. And when I say that, it was so apparent because, of course, the draft hit working class people massively as opposed to the rich. I mean, I'm sure I aren't telling anybody something they don't know here. The rich avoided the draft. Donald Trump, George Bush, they didn't get sent. It was 80% blue-collar workers who got sent, and it was disproportionately black. Incidentally, you should know this. The US Army in Vietnam was the first time it ever fought as an integrated army. The US Army was always segregated. During the Second World War, the US Army was segregated between black and white, not in Vietnam, and that becomes significant. And the black workers who were drafted were disproportionately combat troops and therefore suffered much greater losses. Up to a quarter of all the combat deaths were black troops. And they were told you were going to fight communism. That's what you're going to do, to defend America. And it became very, very obvious, very, very quickly, to anybody who went there that that was simply just bullshit. And I'll give you a few quotes from what people said at the time. I'll give you one quote, which is this. This is from a man called Michael Clodfelter, who was an infantryman in the 101st Airborne. He said, "We arrived in a country expecting to encounter uniformed communist hordes, but found instead this strange small people wearing peasant garb and their inscrutable smiles. We found it hard to believe that these weak, undernourished-looking peasants could really present a threat and a danger to all our battalions of big, husky, heavily armed GIs. It seemed a laughable country in a laughable war, and until we started running into explosive evidence of the enemy's existence, until we started becoming a part of the red results of their cunning and courage." In other words, they very quickly realised they were fighting against people who had something to fight for. And that really meant that they weren't simply fighting a conventional war, they were fighting the entire Vietnamese people. And again, I'll give you another quote. This is again from another soldier. "I had to accept that the vast majority of people were pro-Viet Cong and anti-Saigon. I had to accept also that the position we were in Vietnam because we were in sympathy with the aspirations of and the desires of the Vietnamese people was a lie. If this is a lie, how many others are?" So in other words, very quickly, the grunts on the ground, the troops, realised that they were fighting a war based on a lie. And on the question of race, for black troops in particular, it was quite obvious they were being sent to fight in a war which absolutely wasn't theirs. And I'm not going to give you a great political tract. I'll tell you what Muhammad Ali said. This is his... People have heard the quote, you know, "No Viet Cong has ever called me nigger." Actually, he said more than that. This is what he said. "Why should you..." They asked me. And by the way, Muhammad Ali was drafted in 1966. The world heavyweight champion was drafted, and he went to his induction in 1967. This is what he said. This is what he said to them. He said, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going to go 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. This is the day when such evil must come to an end. I have been warned that to take such a stand would put my prestige in jeopardy and would cause me to lose millions of dollars, which will accrue to me as the champion. But I have said it once and I will say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. I will not disgrace my religion, my people, or myself by becoming a tool to enslave those who are fighting for their own justice, freedom and equality. If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have had to draft me. I'd join tomorrow. But I either have to obey the laws of the land or the laws of Allah. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs. So I'll go to jail. We've been in jail for 400 years. Now, when you have somebody like Muhammad Ali making that statement, you can imagine the impact that has on the black troops who are fighting that war. And in April 1968, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, was murdered in Memphis. And American society exploded. There were literally riots in every major city across America. And King had become not simply a civil rights activist, but had also drawn the links between civil rights and the war. And he'd become an outspoken critic. And of course that impacted on the troops in America, in Vietnam, the American troops in Vietnam. And what you saw very quickly emerge was something which had never happened before in the US Army. And that wasn't simply discontent. There'd always been discontent. Every war, all soldiers are always discontent about the war. But it was organisation. That is the significant development. There had been opposition. right from the beginning, and I'll give you a few examples of it. A black private in Auckland refused to board a troop plane to Vietnam. And although he faced 11 years of hard labour, a Navy nurse was court-martialed for marching in a peace demonstration whilst in uniform and for dropping anti-war leaflets from a plane on Navy installations. 2 black Marines were given long prison sentence for talking to other black Marines against the war. So, I know there are some people who've been in the army. You know, when you organise against the war that you're fighting in, and you're a soldier, you are effectively committing treason. You are regarded as somebody who's fighting for the other side. For this to happen illustrates the problems that existed. But those problems went much deeper in the American army. What you had was, as I say, the emergence of organisation on the ground. There was something between 245 and 300 rank-and-file soldier newspapers begin to circulate in the American army. And again, some of the titles are amazing. The one in Texas was called the FTA, which stands for Fuck the Army. There was several others. I mean, there was the Voice of the Lumpen. There was one called Fort Polk Puke, which was at Fort Polk. That's a hell of a word to say. There was one called Custer's Last Stand. I mean, these were rank-and-file papers. Again, people should read about them. Produced by the soldiers, which basically circulated and said, fuck this war. This isn't our war. What was most worrying for them was that this also happened in the Navy. You had the emergence of organisation in the Navy itself, where soldiers had been producing magazines and so on. You had the emergence of rank-and-file soldier committees, which would say, we ain't going to go out and fight. Before we make any decision to go out and fight, we're going to have a meeting. So they'd say, right, the officer would come along and say, right, you're going out to fight. And they'd say, no, we're not. We're having a meeting about it first. And they'd have a meeting like this. And then they'd have a vote at the end. Are we going to go out and fight? No? Right. Fuck you. I mean, you imagine that it happening in an army. A refusal to fight. Desertions ran at 7%. I mean, 7% is a hell of a number of people deserting. You had American troops who not only didn't want to fight, but used to put red banners round their helmets to show to the Viet Cong they're in solidarity with them. That's what they used to do, and the Viet Cong said, we won't shoot you. So if we knew that, watch the series. If you're not old enough, like me, obviously, to remember the Vietnam War, and I'm looking around, I know people who are laughing, and you are old enough to remember it. You will remember seeing the GIs with no war, fuck the war, on their helmets. Not in the hearts or the heads, but on the helmets. And it was a phenomenal development to take place. More worrying for them, and I'll give you this quote, was the fact that, and I've already mentioned, the fact that there was obviously a civil rights movement and the issues of racism, was the fact that the black troops in America began to say, well, actually, thank you for training us. Because this is what they said. In 1970, Wallace Terry conducted a survey of 392 African-American troops enlisted for the Time and the Washington Post. The survey found that 64% believed that their fight was in the USA, not Vietnam. 83% believed that America is in for more racial violence. And 50% said they would use weapons in the struggle for their rights in the US. And it says, even more ominously for the American ruling class, a significantly high proportion promised to carry home the lessons they had learned in self-defence and black unity to the Black Panther Party. In other words, you had American soldiers saying, our fight is not here, our fight is with you, you've trained us, and we're going to go back and we're going to join a revolutionary organisation and use our military experience to bring the war to you. Now, you imagine the impact that would have on any army. And, you know, again, there's a lot of talk and there's a lot of discussion about the use of drugs in Vietnam. I mean, to be quite frank, if you were in a hellhole like that, you would use any means to just get out of it. But 40,000 American troops were addicted to heroin. I mean, a phenomenal number, but that was because of the nature of the conflict that they were engaged in. Not only that, we had the development of something which is a clear sign that an imperial army is falling apart, and that is fragging. Now, I don't know if people know what fragging is. Fragging was the practice whereby an unpopular officer would have a fragmentation grenade tossed into their tent by one of the grunts. And this wasn't a one-off, by the way. Fragging, I'll give you some figures for the amount of fragging that took place. The killing of officers skyrocketed in the last 3 years of the war. The army reported 126 fraggings in 1969, 271 in 1970, and 333 in 1971. Over 80% of fragging victims were officers or non-commissioned officers. And what this amounted to effectively was soldiers saying, we will kill our officers. And they actually put bounties on the heads of these unpopular officers. Again, you know what? If you watch the documentary, there's one guy who comes on and he says, "Yeah, I know he got fragged. Everybody hated him. He was a real fucker. We hated him." And he said, "I can't say it wasn't a problem, and we had to do it." And he's a soldier saying, we had to kill our officers. And that was a situation which the American ruling class found themselves in with their army. And when, of course, the soldiers who were on they tended to only have a year's service there. When they came back, many of them got straight back involved in the anti-war movement. There was the emergence of a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And again, if you watch the coverage of these soldiers, these young men, some of them disabled, without legs, marching up to the steps of Washington, ripping their medals off, throwing them over the fence. They erected a fence to stop them getting to Washington, shouting out the names of their comrades who died. If you're not moved by that, if you do not feel a sense that is a moment at which American power has been challenged like never before, you don't understand what went on. For people to do that was absolutely, absolutely amazing. And it wasn't just a few of them. There were several thousand of them. They set up a peace camp. They made sure that they headed up all the demonstrations. And I'll give you this final quote, which I think sums up the state of the American army better than any other. This is a quote from Colonel Robert Heinle, a Marine Corps historian, writing in the official Armed Forces Journal. This isn't his private memoirs. This is him writing in the official journal of the American army. He said, "The morale, discipline and battle-worthiness of the US Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse than at any other time in this century and possibly in the history of the United States. By every conceivable indicator, our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers, and non-commissioned officers drug-ridden and dispirited when not near mutinous. Elsewhere than Vietnam, the situation is nearly as serious. All the foregoing facts and many other indicators of the worst are indicators of the worst kind of military trouble, point to widespread conditions among American forces in Vietnam that have only been exceeded in this century by the French army's mutinies and the collapse of the Tsarist armies in 1916 and 1917. In other words, the American army was in the same state virtually that the Tsarist army was before the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. And he wrote that in the official army journal. So you can see then that they were trying to fight this war with an army that effectively was not only disintegrating, but was threatening to turn its guns on their own ruling class. That was the result, as I say, of the resistance of the Vietnamese people. But it was also the result of the tensions and the rottenness and the corruption and the vile nature of not only the Americans' intentions in Vietnam, but also the nature of American society itself. All the rottenness of American society was reflected in the American army. And it reached the point where, quite clearly, they thought they were on the verge of a 1917 situation as far as the army were concerned. I just want to come on briefly to how this impacted in the US itself. Because there had been small but quite limited opposition to the war from the beginning, but very quickly that escalated. There was the development of what became known as teach-ins. First one was at Michigan State University, where students would get together and then discuss the war. And that quickly became a phenomenon that spread to every university, involving tens of thousands of students, pro and anti-war, in discussing it. The demonstrations, which began several hundred, as they often do at the beginning of wars, escalated to the point where there was over 500,000 people marching in Washington in 1970. One of the things that also contributed to the anti-war feeling was the way in which the TV covered it, and that's the beauty of that documentary. I mean, one thing the American ruling class have learnt since is under no circumstances are you to allow journalists free rein and access to US troops. Now they're embedded and they're effectively wings of the US military machine. Then they had reporters going into battle alongside these troops. It's quite it's quite amazing. There was also the uncovering of a series of horrific massacres. The massacre at My Lai in particular was abhorrent, where over 500 old men, women, children and babies were butchered. I mean, literally butchered. And that butchering, incidentally, was stopped by a US helicopter pilot who landed and turned his machine guns on the American troops and said, "You either stop it now or we open fire on you." You had John Kerry, who later became a Democratic candidate, who at that time was one of the few rich kids there who gave evidence of the level of atrocities to a Senate inquiry. We also need to scotch, I think, the idea that the opposition to the war was just among long-haired hippies and students. Absolutely not. The opposition to the war was greatest amongst the working class, for good reason, because they're the ones who bore the brunt of it. I mean, in 1971, a survey revealed 71% of people thought the war was a mistake, and 58% thought it was immoral. And one of the other impacts of the war, of course, was that the US state had to therefore try to control, because it couldn't control its army, and it couldn't defeat the Viet Cong. It had to control and destroy the anti-war movements. And this led to a series of absolutely outrageous and brutal attacks on demonstrators, with tens of thousands being arrested. But it also led to events at two universities, and I say two because the second one's often overlooked. In 1970, 4 students at Kent State University were shot dead by the National Guard on an anti-Vietnam protest. Incidentally, 2 of those were even part of the protest. One was an officer with training to be an officer who was just looking at it, shot dead. Can you imagine? 4 students in Britain shot dead by the army. And then 10 days later, 2 more black students at Jackson State University were also shot dead. And this led to 4.5 million students occupying and striking. 4.5 million students. There was outrage across America. And the radicalisation of American society as a result of the Vietnam War was absolutely profound. Again, something I didn't know until I watched the documentary. One of the American prisoners of war, a man called Kushner, who was interviewed on the documentary, by the way, his wife, who was one of the wives of the POWs, she became an anti-war activist. All the people that you see interviewed, by and large, all the rank-and-file soldiers who you listen to in this documentary, you think, well, that's a bit of a funny thing to say to start with. And as you watch the series, they become more and more radicalised until you see the pictures of them giving clenched fist salutes and so on. So I'll just finish with this, really. In 1971, somebody leaked what became known as the Pentagon Papers, which were a series of classified documents, 7,000 pages of classified documents, to the US press, which revealed in absolute detail how the American ruling class had lied, dissembled, misled, and deliberately sent people to their deaths in a war they knew they could never win. And again, that led ultimately to the demise of Nixon. And so, just to sum up, really, the thing about the Vietnam War is this: we are used to the lies. You know, say we, or the left are used to the lies that our ruling class will tell people in order to justify their latest imperialist adventure. It's not often that those lies are exposed in the way that they were in Vietnam, where the brutality and the indifference of the ruling class, not simply to the lives of the people, the Vietnamese people, but also to the lives of the soldiers they sent over to Vietnam. There were 3 million Vietnamese people died in that war, 3 million. There were 58,000 American troops died. It was the most shattering experience for millions of people. But what it also showed is this: imperialism is not invincible. Even the most powerful army ever assembled from the most powerful state to ever exist is not invincible. On the conditions that, one, people resist, people stand up, the people who are on the end and the receiving end fight back, and secondly, the people who are trying to deliver that, the soldiers, also begin to organise and see that their class interests lie not with killing Vietnamese people, but with turning their guns on their ruling class. That's why that quote about 1917 from the American Army General was so important, because what it proved is that the ruling class, understood that in Vietnam, the prospect not simply of losing a war faced them, but also that war could then turn into their greatest fear, and that is revolution at home.
Hi, I'm Vala. I'm from Bristol branch. I just wanted to touch on how we across the world are actually still living in some of the after effects of the Vietnam War, namely the war on drugs policy that has spread throughout the world. I think recently it came out, I think an old Nixon aide basically leaked recordings of a meeting showing that they explicitly chose to link heroin with black activists and marijuana or cannabis with anti-war activists, and then heavily criminalise both of those as a way of undermining the social movement that was happening. And obviously this was a policy that then spread throughout the world. It started just off in the US, but obviously we have it here now as well. And I think it's worth noting that something that happened so far away and what could be quite a long time ago, we are still living in the implications of it now.
I'm one of the people that Yunus saw laughing, because I am bloody old enough to remember the Vietnam War. And I just wanted to say something briefly about the wider rebellion against it that took place. Down the road in Grosvenor Square, two demonstrations in 1968, British anti-war, European anti-war, anti-Vietnam activists. It marked a great step forward in the combativity of the left after World War II. Before that, you had CND protests, people sitting down. In 1968, people were prepared to take on the police, fight the police, try to get through to the American embassy. So just something there as well about that, and about the fact that it's very easy. I was in America in '68. I was one of those long-haired hippies hitchhiking around, but also I saw how completely polarized the society was. There were the ghetto uprisings, there was the counterculture, there were the anti-Vietnam protests, and also the seizure of parts of cities like Boston Common, where they seized it and they refused to give it up. And really, Vietnam ran like a thread through all that, It was a lightning conductor for the anger that people felt. And just a last point, the American weaponized state has never dared reintroduce conscription, and it will never, I think, ever reintroduce conscription because it saw what happened in 1968.
Thank you. After this, come right into the
Yeah, I think if you didn't know anything about Vietnam, Yunus provided a very good introduction indeed. I think it's so many things to say, but there's a great man who's still fortunately alive. I don't agree with everything he says these days, particularly John Pilger, who has written a lot about Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on. And one of the things he says quite right, is so many myths about the inverted commas American tragedy. But as he rightly and other people have pointed out, has been said, for the Vietnamese, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a complete bloody disaster. And somehow they've managed to rebuild the country. The whole series of lies through President Johnson, Nixon, Ford, that this was an honourable war. That, as Ford later said, we want peace with honour. Nixon talked about peace with honour. But at the same time, him and Kissinger were talking about dropping the bomb, potentially, the big bomb, the A-bomb, on the Vietnamese. The fact that they lied, they sold a lie about the Gulf of Tonkin, a whole series of lies. These people talk about fake news. These people were perhaps the instigators of fake news. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Bay of Tonkin incident, the whole series of lies in which supposedly communist part of Vietnam invaded the liberal democratic part of Vietnam. Lie after lie after lie. And as Yunus says, this eventually came to hit home, came to rebound on them in the biggest ways. The other thing, there was cultural resistance as well. You know, people like Edwin Starr wrote a song, War, What's It Good For? The Supremes wrote an anti-war song or two. Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? Whole numbers of people, as Yunus said, who had relatives, family members, or had friends, either killed or came back fucked in the most terrible way. And the way the American state treated the Vietnam vets was filthy. And we see the parallels today. People come back from the Iraq War, Afghanistan wars, the way the veterans are just treated as shit, basically. A man called Bobby Muller, who Pilger talked about a lot in some of his documentaries and that, founded a Vietnam vets self-help group, effectively, for want of a better word. They were castigated. He had to beg for money. That's the way they treated a man who was he came back in a wheelchair because of the injuries he sustained. That's the way the American state treated these people. The last thing as well, all the films that come out, so many films, there's some good aspects to them, Apocalypse Now, Platoon, but it's always seen from the poor old Americans' angle. Until a film which has got his problems perhaps, but Born on the 4th of July. Now, a great man who wrote that, came over here, spoke about, Ron Kovac came over here, spoke, still an anti-war activist. That's when you see things breaking through. And as I say, yes, it was a tragedy. Obviously, it was a tragedy for the, as you say, working class Americans who went out there and suffered and mentally tortured psychologically tortured forevermore. For the Vietnamese, it was a bloody disaster, which they fortunately have come through a bit.
Hazel Galloply, York SWP. I'm a Londoner by birth, and I was one of these people that Yunus mentioned. I used to sit down on CND marches, and I subsequently was on the Vietnam protests, including Grosvenor Square. Also, during this period in the 60s, I started putting up draft dodgers in my London home. And that was very interesting because, of course, I was getting a lot of information about what was actually going on in the war. But moving on from there, I just wanted to mention the Falklands War. Because during that time, I went to see a film called Platoon by Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone was actually in the Vietnam War, and this film, to me, it was like watching the TV coverage that we were getting during the Vietnam War. I mean, it was amazing, actually, when you think about it, what we were seeing. And Yunus mentioned this, and I think that actually opened the eyes to a lot of people, and more people started joining the protests. Questions were asked at that time. Why aren't we getting proper coverage of what's going on in the Falklands War? And we were told that it was a technical problem. I mean, the Vietnam War coverage used to arrive on a plane because obviously we didn't have, the technology that we had even then in the Falklands War. And of course, Yunus did mention that we now get people embedded who are covering the war. So we don't ever get the true stories unless we get them 50 years later, but we don't necessarily get them at the time. And we should do more about, I think, making sure or trying to, make more noises about this because wars happen all the time and we don't know necessarily, unless we read Socialist Worker, of course. We don't necessarily know exactly what's going on.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, highlight the fact that the Vietnam Wars and the victory in Vietnam had an echo all around the third world. And it showed to the people in the third world that US and European imperialism could be defeated. For instance, the Algerians in the FLN and Frantz Fanon couldn't stop talking about Dien Bien Phu. And just a year when they defeated the French, and just a year later, they kicked out the French in their own country. And for instance, in Tanzania, during the Vietnam War against America, my grandfather was a lecturer, and he told me one day that his students basically decided to walk out and go to the city of Dar es Salaam and protest in solidarity with Vietnam. And also the victory of the Vietnam War showed that an anti-war movement in the West, in the United States of America, where the working class is a crucial element, can win. And I think these are lessons for today. Now, what I find funny, and I think, and I wanted to know if you could comment on that, Yunus, is that in the aftermath of the victory of the Vietnam War by the US, I think what the American army managed to do is contain, if you want, the domino effect, the spread of communism, by making an alliance with communist China. I think today the America in the Middle East is probably in a much weaker position because it went in, it tried to invade Iraq and then discipline all the other nations, but in the end that strategy hasn't been successful for them. And now in the US, in the Middle East, apart from Israel, the US has all sorts of like enemies, which puts them in a much weaker position. And and I think that would be the good basis to build up stop the war movement in the West. Thanks.
Yeah, Phil, South London, SWP. I'm actually one of the people Yunus mentions when he says the sort of conscription in Britain, because when I finished school at 15, went on a YTS. got kicked off my YTS when I was 17 and joined the army. Literally, at the time I was a boxer, and someone told me if you join the army, they'll just pay you to box, so I did, which was good for about a year. I've watched the programme. Me and Yunus have pretty much been talking about it every day since it come out. And when Yunus talks about the reporters, when you're in the army now and you go anywhere, they are so paranoid about you talking to the press. If the press comes up, you've got to refer them to the press officer, who's like a commissioned officer, and they'll talk on your behalf, unless you're told what to say and all that. And on the programme, there was some brilliant reporters out there. Neil Sheehan, who was in the programme, and there was actually, really early on, there was generals that used him because they knew America couldn't win the war, and they couldn't say it. So they were basically asking him to write the truth. And when he's out there, not just him, but other reporters, there's one clip on the programme where they just speak to an American soldier, and they put a microphone in front of his face. They say, "What do you think about the Viet Cong?" Expecting this. And certainly says, "The Viet Cong are the best soldiers in the world." And the reporter says, "Pardon?" You're live on American news. He says, "The Viet Cong are the most highly trained, the most dedicated, the most motivated, and the best soldiers in the world. I wish we had some people like that here." And he's like, it's on the programme. And the other bit, the big, on the Vietnam New Year, the big uprising that's sort of defeated military by the North Viet, right at the end, when the South, the police force from the South start like cracking down on everyone that was involved, there's an American reporter there who takes a photograph at the exact second that the South Viet Cong basically in the middle of the street, no one will shoot. He tells all his men to shoot someone and they won't, so he gets the gun himself, presses the trigger, and this photographer just took a photo at the exact second the bullet basically claps his head, and that made it onto American news. And they interviewed an American woman whose son had died, and she said, "That's when I realised why are we there? Why they're not our friends. My son didn't go there to be friends with these people." And just the whole thing about reporters, every army has never got over it. One very last point. Since Vietnam, I don't think any imperialist army has gone anywhere else to occupy a country and won. The Russians couldn't do it in Afghanistan. The British and Americans later couldn't do it in Afghanistan. The British and Americans couldn't do it in Iraq. The British couldn't do it in Ireland. We've probably seen the last, really, of that thing. Now it's like what we see in Syria, where it's proxy bombing and things like that. So it took a while for them to learn the lessons, but I don't think we'll see that type of imperial long-term thing in the country again.
Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm from York Branch. I was in Washington last year and I went to the Vietnam Memorial, and the lady that took us around said it was really sad because it was the soldiers themselves that had to put in for the National Memorial, which should have been, the government, but the government scapegoated the soldiers who they'd forced to go and fight in Vietnam. They didn't want to, and I think that's important as well. The memorial's beautiful, but it's thanks to the soldiers, it's thanks to their solidarity that they got sort of the justice they deserved, a memorial for the people they'd lost. And I just think the whole hypocrisy of the war of, saying to the people that America has oppressed the most, go and fight for your country, the country that oppresses you, go and fight for us. It's a way of putting people in their boxes, but I'm so glad to look back and see the solidarity that people had, and actually that helped the causes of, the oppressed in America. And so, leading from that, I have a question, because obviously as socialists, we oppose war because it's the people at the top who want war, and it's the people at the bottom that have to fight, and that, as the way capitalism works, it's the workers who have to work and fight and die on behalf of capitalists. So my question is, is war like a necessary evil to overthrow capitalism? Because, as Yunus said, the American army were on their knees thanks to the Vietnam War, and out of that, if the solidarity of the people who were oppressed was at its peak, that, as it happened in Russia, that's when revolution happens. So is war necessary to break capitalism down and, have a revolution? So that's it.
But is that too loud, too close? Very quickly, some interrelated events. In the 1960s, when the Vietnam War was on, I was arguing with Labour Party members in Peterborough in the east of England, about why Labour Party shouldn't be, and the Labour government under Harold Wilson, our great leader, should not be thinking of sending British troops to support the Yanks. That's one thing. Second thing, 1957, Windscale. Nobody remembers that name. Now Sellafield. An explosion that wasn't officially revealed to the British public till 1975. Picture's worth 1,000 words. The American helicopter leaving the roof of the embassy in Good Morning Vietnam. Remember that picture, how successful that can show you everything. Thanks for your time.
Vietnam was also a full vindication of something that Trotsky and Lenin had argued at the time of the Russian Revolution. Against those who said that socialists shouldn't get involved in the struggles of small and oppressed countries, because that would be, it would mean compromising with nationalism. Lenin and Trotsky said that actually, socialists should be fully behind the struggle of small nations, partly because that would weaken the imperialist countries and their ruling classes, but also because it would have an impact on the hold of the ideology of the ruling class on the working class of the oppressed countries. And that proved to be the case in Russia, but much more clearly in the 60s with Vietnam, because the inability of the American army to have a quick victory sparked mass revolts in the US, in the heart of the US empire, in the form of the Black Movement, the anti-war movement, but also it had an impact on the students revolting in Paris in May and across the world. And of course, it can be argued that the defeat of the US in Vietnam didn't lead to the establishment of a more equal and less exploitative society in Vietnam. But I think we need to understand that in the context of the workers' movement and the liberation struggles across the world, dominated by the Stalinist parties. And the Stalinist parties, the communist parties internationally, had developed a theory, a stages theory, that fitted the geopolitical interest of Russia at the time, according to which basically the countries of the global south were only ready for a national democratic revolution in alliance with the bourgeoisie and the middle classes, after which the fight for socialism would begin. And of course, this was a blatant denial of the actual experience of the Russian Revolution, and it didn't have to end that way. But I think that Vietnam and the whole experience of what happened in the US shows that socialists have a fundamental duty of standing with the oppressed of all nations and give unconditional, although of course not uncritical, support to all the genuine anti-imperialist struggles.
I like a book which is titled "Kill All the Gentlemen." That's the type of book everybody should read, really, isn't it? I want to answer a few of the points and raise a couple of other issues. You see, I think we've got to understand. I've talked really about the impact in American society of the Vietnam War and how it created this situation of acute political crisis, where literally a generation of people were turned into, at least in their heads, revolutionaries. That came at a time when the American left generally was incredibly weak. The years of anti-McCarthyism, of the McCarthyite witch hunts in the 1940s and the 1950s had more or less wiped out the American left. So what you had was a situation where there was this enormous radicalisation of students and young workers and so on, at the same time that official politics didn't reflect that in any shape, way or form. I mean, we had, again, the site of the Democratic Convention where anti-war demonstrators, both on the conference floor and outside of it, were beaten to shit on the orders of a Democratic police chief in Chicago. So it's important to understand that. It's also important to understand that the one element I haven't mentioned is industrial action against the war. There wasn't any strikes as far as I know. I mean, maybe people can enlighten me, but I don't think there was. And the reason for that wasn't because that wouldn't have been possible. It was because of the disgusting, treacherous role of the American trade union bureaucracy, who were hand in glove with the American ruling class. I mean, not every single one of them, as hard as some, but all of them were committed to the maintenance of the system itself, despite the rank and file position of many of their members being opposed to the war. And so consequently, you need to understand why it is, therefore, that a potential 1917 situation, a situation where the army was collapsing, where the American ruling class were completely at their wits' end, where there was open revolt, didn't go further. And again, if you want an indication of how far the American ruling class were rattled, this is what Henry Kissinger, the war criminal, had to say. He said, it was a time, this is after 150,000 people had demonstrated in Washington just after Kent State. He says, those few days after Kent State were amongst the darkest of my presidency. This is Nixon speaking. And then Kissinger said this, it was a time of extraordinary stress. Washington took on the characteristics of a besieged city. The very fabric of government was falling apart. The executive branch was shell-shocked. Exhaustion was the hallmark of us all. How awful for him. I had to move from my apartment, ringed by protesters, into the basement of the White House to get some sleep. Nixon, deeply wounded by the hatred of the protesters, reached a point of exhaustion that caused his advisers deep concern, and he seemed on the edge of a nervous breakdown. And one other, the Attorney General, said as he watched from the window this demonstration, he felt it was like the Russian Revolution. That is the impact that anti-war movement was having on the American ruling class. That it didn't become the American Revolution is largely as a result of the factors that I've mentioned, the weakness of the left, the role of the trade union bureaucracy and so on. But what it showed is how quickly a society, which at that time, let's be clear, was at the peak of its economic power. You know, America was a society which said, we are the epitome, the greatest point in human history. And they could say that with the greatest productive power of any state that had ever existed. And yet still, within a short period of time, they found themselves in a situation such as I've just described. A couple of other things quickly. I think we cannot overlook the role of Stalinism and the rottenness of that tradition. First of all, in terms of the, and it's got to be said, yes, absolutely, we stood, our organisation, the IS, the International Socialists, stood in absolute solidarity with the struggle against American imperialism. But we did not have any illusions in the role of the Vietnamese Stalinist regime, which incidentally had butchered the Trotskyists in Vietnam. We should have, so one time I think we should have a meeting on the role of the Vietnamese Trotskyists in the period after the Second World War, when they had a large organisation which Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist supporters, his Stalinist supporters, butchered. And one of the things that you saw, for example, I mentioned the Tet Offensive. The reason there wasn't an uprising when the Tet Offensive was launched, when they should have been, is because the Stalinists didn't see the South Vietnamese working class as an instrument of its own liberation, but they saw them as people who would be liberated by them. In other words, they didn't organise as amongst the South Vietnamese working class and peasants. They saw them simply as somebody who would come out in support of their military struggles. That was one of the key weaknesses. But also the role, it's got to be said, of China and of Russia in this. You know, any idea that these were anti-imperialists, although they were arming to a large extent the North Vietnamese regime, could be illustrated by the pressure that they constantly put on the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese to compromise. When Nixon in 1971 went to visit the Chinese regime in Beijing, he did so for the express purpose of winning the Chinese ruling class to his position against supporting the Vietnamese struggle. And they were amenable to that. Why? Because as a ruling class, they had their own interests. Their interests were not to foment international revolution, but to ensure that their particular state had as much influence as possible. So therefore, the Vietnamese people were used as a pawn by both sides in that war. Just a couple of other things. People asked about the... I think a comrade mentioned the impact that it had on other national liberation struggles. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. In the years... again, America finally left. Pulled out completely in 1975. I mean, there's this great picture of them, scrambling onto the last helicopters as they try to get out of Saigon. But that impacted right the way across the world. The successful liberation struggles which saw in Mozambique and in Angola and Southern Africa, people being inspired by this, was absolutely, as a comrade said, as a result of the success and the victory of the Viet Cong. And therefore we saw how, what happens in one part of the world impacts on another. And it's very, very important to understand that, because as internationalists, we ain't just bothered about what happens here. We draw inspiration from the struggles of our brothers and sisters on an international scale, just as in the same way that they draw inspiration from us. And that's why, for example, slightly off topic, why is it so important that we ensure that we give a decisive defeat to the forces of the far right that's growing in Britain, because we want to give an example to our comrades throughout Europe who are battling against the same forces that these filthy bastards can be defeated. So it might not be on the scale of the Vietnam War, but it is every bit as significant for our side to inflict defeats on their side and their forces whenever and wherever we encounter them. On the question, incidentally, of draft dodgers, I have to say this. If we were in Vietnam at the time, we would not dodge the draft. We would go with our class. We would have argued that people, and American revolutionaries did argue, that they actually went with the army. I mean, I can understand why people dodge the draft, absolutely. I mean, there is no shame in that. But we would have gone, and we would have gone and fought, and we could have made sure, and revolutionaries could have made sure, that the agitation and organisation within inside the army started to reach the point not simply of mutiny, but of open revolutionary activity against them. Now, I mean, that's a theoretical argument in one sense, but it's important to understand, as people have explained, that armies are by and large, even economically conscripted armies, as the one we've got, nevertheless reflect class divisions. It's not the generals who die on the battlefield. It's not the generals or their sons who have to worry about whether or not they're going to get a job or have a home or have an income when they come back. Oh no, they're well looked after. It's our side who are sent to fight and die on the battlefields, and it's our side and our class and then are treated like pieces of shit when they come back. And we have to make that point time and time again. And just lastly, a comrade asked, is it a necessary evil? What is war a necessary evil? War is a part of capitalism. It is an integral part of it. It is the means by which the ruling class ultimately can exert their influence against another section of the ruling class. Marx called the bourgeoisie a band of hostile brothers. They may be brothers, but they hate each other because they're constantly at war with each other, whether economically, politically, or if it needs to be militarily. The problem for the American ruling class is this. In a world in which their chief rival has been knocked out the game, Russia, they still are not able, because of what happened in Vietnam, to exert their political and military hegemony around the world as they see fit. They are constantly worried about the impact that those wars will have. And I actually think that, even though the American military today is not the same as it was, there is still clear signs inside that army of massive discontent. All the polls show that the vast majority of American people regard the military adventures in Afghanistan and Iraq as a mistake. They know that. I mean, for God's sake, even Trump had to say it, didn't he? He had to say that because that reflected what his supporters and what the people on the ground felt. And just lastly, even when they think they've got away with it, even when they think that they've learned all the lessons, they haven't. Where's Tony Blair? What's happened to him? He went to Iraq, didn't he? The great leader. He fell as a result of the Iraq War. George Bush fell as a result of the Iraq War. Wars don't always work out for the ruling class in the way that they want. They hope they will, but they don't always. And I'll come back to this. They don't because, 1, people resist, 2, the people who fight them resist, and 3, the people who are supposed to support the war resist. When you bring those elements together, and when you also include inside that the understanding that war will continue to be waged by the ruling class at our expense, only to the point whereby we get rid of them. And that, again, is why the references that the American ruling class made throughout the Vietnam War to the experiences of Russia in 1917 are so important, because they are haunted, yes, by Vietnam, but they're haunted every single day of their lives by the knowledge that sometimes those imperialist adventures, those wars, don't just lead to revolts, don't just lead to impeachment. They lead to the overthrow of their entire system by a revolutionary movement from below. And that is what frightened them in Vietnam, and that's what we've got to make sure happens every time they start to take us on the path to war again.